Well, hello there, and welcome to Pastor's Perspective, sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. My name is Brian Perez, and we've got a very special edition of the program today, a very special guest, so we won't be taking phone calls today, but I'm sure you will have lots of questions after you hear today's program, and there will be a way to get some of those questions answered later tonight, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later on. In the studio with me today, Pastor Brian Broderson, the senior pastor of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa in Southern California. On the Bobby Cam, it's Bobby Conway from Image Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and also the guy you see on the ChristianityStillMakesSense.com website and YouTube channel. And we've got a very special guest who will be speaking at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa tonight at 6:30. It's part of Calvary Costa Mesa's summer lecture series happening on Wednesdays. You're invited to come out if you're here locally. We'd love to have you out. And the topic tonight is going to be, has Christianity done more harm than good? John Dixon will be leading the lecture. He's who's here in the studio with us today. John Dixon, welcome to Pastor's Perspective.
Thank you for having me.
Now, John is an author, speaker, historian, media presenter. He's authored more than 20 books, 2 of which became TV documentaries. He also co-hosted a documentary called For the Love of God, How the Church is Better and Worse Than You Ever Imagined. Dr. Dixon teaches a course on the historical Christ at the University of Sydney, Australia, not Florida, and researches the origins of Christianity in the Roman Empire. He is a visiting academic in the Faculty of Classics at Oxford University and distinguished fellow and senior lecturer in public Christianity at Ridley College, Melbourne. How about that resume, Bobby Conway? Isn't that impressive, would you say?
Oh, yeah. And we're so happy to have you on, John.
Totally.
We love what you're doing with Undeceptions and love Bullies and Saints. And Pastor Brian turned me on to you, and we just cut our teeth on your stuff. So welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you for taking time to be with us.
Yes. Undeceptions is Australia's #1 religion podcast, which explores aspects of life, faith, history, or ethics that are either much misunderstood or mostly forgotten. So, man, we are going to learn a lot in the next hour.
John, I'm curious, and welcome. It's so good to have you.
Thanks.
What percentage of listeners are U.S.-based of Undeceptions? I've always sort of wondered that.
About 40% now.
40%?
Yeah.
Good.
Wow.
And growing.
Gaining some ground.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll get a few people jumping on board from our time together today. Now, everything you just said about John, all of that amazing stuff there, but there's one additional thing that we need to point out, and that is his recent move from the wonderful city of Sydney, Australia, to the wonderful town of Wheaton, Illinois.
It's true. Yes, 8 months ago.
Yes.
We came here, my wife and our youngest child, leaving the 2 older ones back home in Sydney.
So why did you guys move to this little sort of Midwestern town? What's the draw there?
Well, I mean, I'd known of Wheaton College, obviously,
Yes.
For many years. And they had a new endowed chair that was focused on precisely the things I've been focused on for so many years. And they somehow convinced me that it would be a really good idea to move from the beach in Sydney to Wheaton College. And, you know, look, if I'm honest, my motivation was simply I love America and have been coming here 20 years, a couple of times a year, and have watched the secularization of America at rapid speed.
Yes.
And I feel like Australia is 10 to 15 years ahead of America in secularization. We're 30 years behind on everything else, but on secularization, we're ahead. And I've been trying to engage with that kind of post-Christian environment for 30 years. So I wanted to come here and help out, if I can, work out what does it mean to try and reach a post-Christian America.
Yeah. And John, honestly, I think that is so important. And I know what you've done in Australia, and I understand that that cultural context, having spent some time in Australia. And we are rapidly doing our best to catch up with the rest of the, Europe, the UK, Australia, Canada even. And I do think we need help. And I think the kind of help we need is the kind of help that you're offering. Because I don't know that most Christians know how to really handle the secularization, the rapid secularization. People don't know what to do. And so I'm glad you're here.
Yeah. Well, so are we. We've had a wonderful 8 months.
Yeah. Wish you were in Southern California.
We arrived only 3 hours ago in Southern California, and my daughter, who came with us, 17 years old, pretty much as soon as we landed, she said, "Why didn't we move here?" And then we stupidly took her to the beach down at Newport. Is it Newport Beach?
Newport Beach.
Yeah, at the pier there. And she said, "I want to move here, Dad. This is where I want to be."
Yep.
That's great. All right. Okay, so John, just give us a little, minute or two, kind of a clip of what we can expect tonight at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa.
Well, in some ways, I'm answering the question that a lot of people who don't believe are asking.
Yeah.
Has Christianity done more harm than good?
Yeah.
And the surveys have found that about 4 in 10 Americans reckon the answer is it's done more harm than good.
Wow.
It's worse in Australia, where 6 in 10 Australians think that. But it's an increasing number here. And I want to approach that in a way that is honest, historically responsible, concedes a lot of what needs to be conceded, and not just as a strategy, because Christians have done terrible things through history and today. But then I want to help people navigate, well, what does it really mean? What does it tell you about the Christian faith that people have done terrible things? And what is the through line, or in the terms I'll use tonight, what is the beautiful melody that Christ set for the church? That the church has sometimes sung in tune and sometimes out of tune. But what is the melody, and can you still hear it today?
Yeah, that's great. So tonight at 6:30 at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, we would love to have you join us for the live session with John, and we'll have a little Q&A afterwards. So, Bobby, I was wondering, because yesterday you and I talked a little bit, I said, okay, bring your good questions from our different podcasts and so forth that we've listened to with John. So you got something on your mind?
I actually do have a question for John. And you just mentioned that you came from Australia 8 months ago. You estimate that Australia might be 15 years ahead on the secularist agenda. As a historian, my question for you would be, given the movement of secularism, at what point does a secular culture even catch itself and say, enough's enough? Like in America, you're seeing a little bit of resistance as it relates to the T in the LGBTQ with transgender sports and things of like nature, using the restrooms, the kids being exposed to drag queens. So I guess my question is, what's beautiful about Christianity, as you know, John, is at least we have some moral governance that allows us to kind of feel our way through moral terrain. But when you lack that biblical objectivity and you don't use the Bible as a source and secularism is your agenda, well, what is the moral code that eventually says enough is enough? You're destroying yourself as a culture. Like, when do we start putting some boundaries up in a secular culture because we realize we're destroying ourselves?
Or are there boundaries? Because they might say, no, we can't put boundaries up. Anything goes. We have to stick to that.
That's right.
Sadly, I think we've got a long way to go before that realization really comes upon the culture. So yes, Christians are already spotting it. And, for years have been saying too far, too quick, come back. But actually, a lot of the, let's call them happy pagans, which is what we might call the average Sydney-sider, a happy pagan, they haven't felt like this has been a problem yet. There are the first hints of it, depression, anxiety rates, suicidation, a kind of a loss of something bigger than yourself. Like, people are beginning to talk about this, but I still think Australia has years to go before it bottoms out. And I think America does as well. Even if Christians are already saying, too far, come back. And there will be some early adopters, we might say, the secularist early adopters, who spot that secular culture is basically empty and vacuous on the moral front. And they may see that a return to the Christian foundation is the right thing. But I think that's still going to be a minority for quite a few years, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, it is interesting, though, even recently in the UK and even parts of Europe where they're now pushing back a little bit on the trans agenda. And so people here are asking the question, like, when are our leaders going to maybe follow the cues that we're getting from the Europeans? We've got this, is it the Surgeon General? Who's the guy who's trans, who, is the guy who wears a dress and he's...
Oh, yes. I can't think of the name right now.
What's his name? Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. I'm asking the Australian, who is this guy?
Is it not the Secretary of Health?
Yes, it is the Secretary of Health.
Yes.
So I'm just looking today, and he is drilling down deeper into the need to provide surgery and so forth, and hormone blockers and all for for children, where again sort of in the UK and Europe there's some pushback on it. So people are asking, like, well, when are these guys going to start seeing what's going on over in Europe and maybe get a clue that
you might see a bounce back on that particular issue sooner than 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
But on the broader question of can secular culture really sustain itself?
Yeah.
I think we're decades away, sadly.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you being a historian, you know that these things tend to have long life.
Takes a long time.
Well, if you're talking 15 years ahead, you were saying Australia is 15 years ahead of the U.S., and if they haven't hit rock bottom, it's going to be at least 15 years plus, possibly, here in the U.S.
Yes. So, I mean, strictly speaking, the number of people who say that they're Christians in America is about where we were 12 years ago in Australia. And now we are 44%. So in 2021, the national census, where people get to tick, whether they're religion or no religion, it was 44% saying that they're Christian. And the media made a big deal of this because for the first time in Australian history, it's a minority of people who say they're at all involved with Christianity. That number is still around 70 in America. Now, in the UK, it just dropped to 48% when we were in Oxford together in December.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it was big news. Yeah. So Australia and Britain are about the same. But as I say, about 12 years ago, we were at something like 65%, which is roughly where America is.
Wow. Bobby, I think you had a question.
So do you think that it will take consequences over the coming years in order for us to see the decisions that we've made? I mean, it does seem like one of the concerns in this moral revolution, John, is we're making decisions so fast. Politicians want votes, and so they'll commit to making decisions without even looking at the data. And so I wonder what type of things besides consequences, or is it consequences, when you look at history, which brings about sort of, if you're looking at like a Hegel's, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, it's like things are always changing. At what point does the ebb and flow begin to bounce back, or will it just be consequences that makes this happen?
I think on specific issues, there might be a quick bounce back, as I say, on the transgender issue. But on the general issue of does secularism work, I think, I'm sorry, we're in for decades. And I mean, I think in terms of my specialty is really ancient history. And I think of the way Christianity influenced the Roman Empire. It took 300 years. And even after Constantine was converted, it still took another 80 to 100 years for the Roman Empire to be majority Christian.
Wow.
You know, I mean, even at the end of the 4th century, 70 years after Constantine, the majority of people were pagans. So these things take a long time. The interesting difference that we're already detecting, and I think they are signs of things to come, is that some very important academics are starting, who are secular academics, are starting to say, hey, did you know that all of these values of compassion and humility and egalitarian sort of politics come from Christianity? And so I'm thinking obviously of Tom Holland, the great British historian, who's not a Christian yet, please Lord, but has written a wonderful book basically saying the values that we adore in the Western world that gave us a kind of egalitarian democracy can't have come from Greece and Rome. They only came from Christianity. And I think they're actually going to be interesting allies to the church because they are actually saying, you know, secularism cannot sustain the idea that everyone is equal. You take God out of the picture, there is no argument that can establish human equality because some people are better looking. Brian, I'm looking at you, right? Some people are smarter. Some people are stronger. So you can't argue for equality. The other one is Luc Ferry, who was the French education secretary and an atheist, professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne, who has said openly, as an atheist, all of our values of egalitarian democracy came from Christianity, and we don't have a way of replacing it yet.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I think when you have top tier academics who are already sounding that little bell, I think it's a signal that down the pipeline, sometime, everyone will realize secularism cannot sustain a compassionate, humble, equal community.
Yeah, you know, John, I like history. I enjoy reading it. It's kind of a double-edged sword because I feel like sometimes when I'm listening to people or talking to certain people, I feel like, gosh, if they just knew a little bit of history, they would have probably a different take on this, you know. So on the one hand, like you said, we think of the impact of the early Christians on the Roman world, but we don't actually think about the time that it took for that impact, you know.
Sure.
300 years. We don't care about what's going to happen 300 years from now.
And the pain they had to endure.
Yes, my goodness, yeah. So we've got that reality. The more you understand history, the more you realize that evil, idolatry, we call it secularism today, this kind of stuff can go on and on and on for centuries, literally. So we've got that on the one hand. But then on the other side of it, we have these experiences historically where God steps into a society and he does something extraordinary. And I think most Christians I know, that's the hope. You know, I don't think anybody's looking for the sort of the long, you know, arduous, we're going to go probably into prison or we're going to get executed. And then don't worry, a century from now, Christianity will be revived. You know, most Christians, I think, are saying, Lord, this has got to happen now. We need a move of your Spirit.
Yes, please, Lord.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll have 3 of those.
Yes.
I was just preparing a lecture on the plane here about Boniface, who was a great 7th century missionary from England to pagan Europe. And in his 40 years of ministry, he basically converted Frisia, Holland today, who were really scary pagans. I mean, kill you scary pagans. And indeed, they ended up killing Boniface. Some people rebelled. But he had converted Holland in, let's just say, around 700, the year 700, with his little band of missionaries in a 30 to 40 year period. So remarkable moves of God are possible.
Yeah. Yeah, you think of the Wesleyan revival.
Yeah.
You know, you think, I'm sure you read the book, is it England Before and After Wesley? You know, talking about the state of England before that great moving of the Spirit of God, and how so many things that we would look at as being positive aspects of culture actually were a result of the impact of the revival. Yeah. Yes, Lord, please. that is our prayer.
Right, yeah.
But if that isn't what happens, or even if it does happen, and who knows what scale that will happen on. I think, you could build a case that there are what we might call revivals or awakenings. Some are very local. Some are communities where you have just this extraordinary thing that God does in a community. Sometimes it's bigger than that. Of course, we know about the Great Awakenings and so forth. What we sometimes forget is how much smaller the population of the country and how much smaller the country was during the time of that. But that's what we hope for, that's what we long for, that's what we pray for. But in the meantime, what do we do? That, I think in some ways, that's why you came to America.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Prayer, persuasion, service, suffering.
Yeah.
They are the 4 tools.
Yeah.
Wait,
And-
suffering?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, man.
Okay, we understand prayer, I think generally. Talk about persuasion a little bit.
Well, again, I speak as an ancient historian primarily. The commitment of the early church to persuasion was beautiful. They believed that persuasion could change the world. Mm-hmm. And of course, they got this from Jesus, who went around preaching the good news. Yeah. So they thought, persuasion can change culture.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, in a way that seems sort of obvious to us, but in the ancient world, it was politics and power and armies that changed the world. Mm-hmm. So here was a group of people who thought persuasion could do it. Mm. And they had a number of ways of approaching this. There were some incredible thought leaders in the early Christian movement, thinking of people like Tertullian, Athenagoras, Lactantius, who wrote books and preached in a way that pagans could understand, and they were well schooled in the pagan philosophy, but brought Christ, into comparison with pagan philosophy. So we had a number of sort of what you might call, the air war, like high level people dropping gospel bombs on the culture. But actually, they also had this wonderful thing that we've almost forgotten now, and that is what used to be called catechism. And, we talked about this when we were in Oxford back in December. The early church was absolutely committed to training every single Christian in at least 126 hours of biblical, theological study before you were considered a full Christian. So their discipleship program was a minimum of 126 hours. But what they were trying to do is prepare every Christian to give an answer. And we actually have some of the surviving lectures that these brand new Christians had to endure, and they're quite high level. It's not just, the prophets, the gospels, the creeds. It was also, when a Greek criticizes the virgin birth, here are the 5 things you can say in reply. And the thing is, everyone had to go through catechism, everyone. And what that meant was every Christian was prepared to give an answer for the faith. So when you have the air war carrying on at a beautiful level with the great ancient apologists, and then every Christian schooled in persuasion, I think you have a very powerful formula.
Yeah, that's great. But what about the suffering component that Brian...
Well, service and suffering. Christians committed themselves to the most extreme acts of compassion. They were the only ones searching out people on the streets and bringing them to their hostels and hospitals. They were the only ones collecting abandoned infants because exposure, as it was called, we might think of it as infanticide, was common practice in antiquity. And the Christians would go out in the 2nd and 3rd centuries and collect these infants and raise them as their own. I mean, as a result, millions of people are alive today who are only alive because Christians picked them up around the Roman world in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, picked up their forebears. But the suffering, in that first 3 centuries, there were 5 serious periods of suffering. Each period was only 3 or 4 or 5 years long, but it's enough to sharpen the iron of the Christian.
Yeah.
And the final persecution, immediately before Constantine became a Christian, involved an empire-wide edict to burn all Christian scripture, to demolish Christian places of worship, to force everyone in the empire to sacrifice to the emperors, or they were killed. And literally thousands of Christians gave their lives. We even have a Roman transcript from this period interviewing Christians, demanding their scriptures and sending them to their deaths. And these Christians just thanked God for the opportunity to lose well in Christ's name.
Yeah.
So suffering is a key to mission. And the Christians believed it was one of the demonstrations of the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. Bobby, did you want to jump in with anything?
Well, I think that you're making some great points, John. I think as it relates to suffering, that might be one of the fears that causes so many Christians to not be persuaded. It's easy to walk with the Lord, or easier when the culture's in alignment with the church's values. But the further those values swim away from the church, we start realizing, well, the potential cost, the price tag of following Jesus is going to potentially mean suffering. So therefore, that kind of crowds in on how persuaded I am. And so it's hard to persuade if you're not persuaded yourself. And I think of all the confusion that's going on in the church. So I guess my question would be, how do we go about bringing a new reformation? I've thought before, as I think about history, it seems like God would bring reform before revival, because if we had a big revival and we don't have reform, we're kind of just a mess as a church. It seems like there's some things for us to get unified on. How do we take a big movement in the United States called the church that is seemingly so splintered in the name of our pet particularities, where everybody's dying on 1,000 hills and Jesus dies on one? How do we go about getting unified to have reform, to recognize and spot the true church of Jesus Christ?
Got about 90 seconds.
Man, I feel like as the outsider, I have no right to answer that question. You know, what should Americans do? All I know is that it is a very common response to pressure, from secular pressure, for some Christians to withdraw, go to their holy huddle. For some Christians to do the opposite and attack the culture, become a bully, but that's born of insecurity. And for other Christians to compromise, that is, just go with the culture. And all three are profound mistakes. The only solution, it seems to me, is a cheerful confidence to stand up for everything to do with Christ, and a cheerful humility to lose well if we must.
Yeah, we need to talk about this losing well. And this is something that I think you coined it a bit in your book, Bullies and Saints. And it's a powerful idea, but it's very unattractive. I think especially to American evangelicals. I think that's a very unattractive aspect. And gosh, John, what you said right there, I think that is exactly where the church culture is. Some people withdrawing, some people compromising, and there's a good chunk of people that are attacking. And I think that's, we should talk a little bit more about that when we come back from the break.
That we will. The book is called Bullies and Saints. It's one of the more than 20 books that our guest has written. You can get more information about our guest. His name is John Dixon, Dickson, johndixon.org. His podcast, you can listen to that at, what's the name of it? Undeceptions. Undeceptions.com is where you can go to listen to the podcast, of course, on Apple and Spotify and all that, but that's where you can start, undeceptions.com. All right, we're going to take a little break, and we'll be back with our guest, John Dixon, who will be speaking tonight at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. Hope you can be there. It starts at 6:30. More details at cccm.com. We'll be right back. we're back on Pastor's Perspective, a very special edition of the program. My name is Brian Perez. We're not taking phone calls today. We've got a special guest in the studio. His name is John Dixon, and he's going to be speaking tonight at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. It begins at 6:30 p.m. cccm.com is where you can get more information. It's also where you can send in your questions that might be used tonight in the Q&A that's going to go on after the lecture. So go to cccm.com. One thing I must tell you, though, the lecture is not going to be live streamed on YouTube or anything. You've got to be here at the church to hear the answer to your question. So come on out. You've got like 3 hours to get here wherever you are. We'd love to see you tonight. Starts at 6:30. Brian Broderson of Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa is here as well, along with Bobby Conway from Image Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, joining us via the Bobby Cam. You can find out more about our guest, John Dixon, at johndixon.org, Dixson, johndixon.org, or undeceptions.com. That's where you can get his podcast, and you can get these written over 20 books. I saw some of these book titles here. They're really interesting book titles that are all available. Of course, his latest book called Bullies and Saints, that's the one we're talking about. A Doubter's Guide to Jesus, 666, and all that. The truth about the future. If I were God, I'd end all the pain. If I were God, I'd make myself clearer. You can find out more about these titles and more at undeceptions.com.
You know, John, your first book that I actually, the way I got introduced to you is I picked up your Doubter's Guide to Jesus. And I thought, this is a great book. And then
Thank you.
I think it was actually maybe, I don't know, pre-podcast or somehow the podcast came on my radar at some point. So, Okay, so I want to go back to two things that you said. I want to go back to, ultimately back to the losing thing, which is nobody's a fan of losing. But let's talk just for a second about, because you're talking about the service of the Christians in the early centuries and the things that they did, saving the children from infanticide and so forth. What does that look like today?
Well, I mean, it's wonderful that Christians are still at the forefront of poverty relief programs, caring for single mums. They're involved in schooling and anti-trafficking organizations. Some of the biggest and best are fundamentally Christian organizations. You think of International Justice Mission, and there are plenty of others. So it's always been something Christians have done. It's just that the secular world has also taken on those things.
Which they borrowed from.
They did. And in a sense, we should rejoice at it. And that there is a story one can tell. I mean, it is literally the case that the canon law charity programs of the medieval church were taken over by the English monarchy and the English Parliament between the 1300s and 1600. They literally took all the canon law programs for looking after hospitals, charities, and so on, and made them legally binding at a secular level. So in a sense, the church was absorbed by the state, and that's how now the average secularist thinks it's normal to start schools for the poor and have charities and hospitals for those without and so on. We assume it's normal, but it was entirely because the government took over the Christian charities.
But yeah, like you said, thank God. I think a lot of people, though, and obviously people who are antagonistic toward the faith, and some of this you're going to talk about tonight, no doubt, think that, Christians don't do anything. Oh, no, the government does all of that. They take care of the poor. They worry about these issues and so forth. But And sometimes I even hear young Christians who get influenced by maybe a more progressive mentality saying the same sorts of things. The church is so bad and the church has never done anything, but that really isn't all that accurate.
It's not. And the research of Robert Putnam out of Harvard.
Yes, right.
He's written a bunch of books, Bowling Alone, but his amazing book, American Grace, is the report of a study he ran twice because he just couldn't believe the results that they ran out of Harvard on community building, philanthropy, charitable service amongst the community in America, focused on America. And he concluded, as an avowed non-believer, that Christians are doing the lion's share of philanthropy and volunteering. In fact, he says they volunteer so much, they volunteer more for both secular causes than secular people do and their own religious causes. It's not just that they're doing religious volunteering. They do that, plus they do more secular volunteering. Yeah. That's from Robert Putnam. So the data is there. There's a beautiful story to tell. Christians are still singing the tune of Jesus. It's just that there are a lot of major headlines of Christians behaving badly, which we can't deny, and we shouldn't. You know, we're not the ones who think we're good through and through.
Yeah, yeah.
So we shouldn't defend whenever you see the church criticized. Don't rush to defend it.
Yeah.
Jesus taught us to take the log out of our own eye. He said that to disciples.
Yeah.
So that should be our first instinct.
So this whole idea about losing, though, because nobody wants to lose. And I think, and you know this, but, you know, the U.S., I think Christians are set up a little bit differently here than in Australia. Maybe not Britain, but you know, we have the founding of the country. We have the Constitution. We have all the stories about a Christian nation being formed and all of that stuff.
We were a penal colony.
Yeah, you guys were not that. So this, I think, in the mind of so many Christians, the idea is, no, we have to fight for this. This is, you know, this is our country, that we founded this. So when you start talking about, well, maybe we have to lose, that is not a message that most Christians want to hear.
No, I'm sorry about that. But it's profoundly biblical.
Yes.
I mean, Jesus started this tradition of losing well, of course. You know, Father, forgive them. They don't know not what they do. But he taught it in the Sermon on the Mount, didn't he? When people revile you and slander you and do all sorts of evil against you, what does he say? He doesn't say be grumpy. He says rejoice and be glad. And the early Christians took this to heart. Look, we don't go out of our way to try and lose. My view is, you know, like, prayer, persuasion, service, and suffering. Yeah. You go full tilt with those things. Mm-hmm. But when society says go away and slaps us across the head, our role is to smile sweetly back, to say bless you, and to keep praying, persuading, serving, and suffering. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean. And you see it, you know, we could open up the book of Acts and just go story after story after story after story. I could almost summarize the theme of the book of Acts as the apostles losing really well and the gospel winning, right? The church and the apostles losing, but the gospel winning. So Paul's beaten up and locked up in prison in Philippi, and what does he do? Sings hymns and leads the jailer and his family to Christ. I love that 10 years later he writes to the Philippians because he's now in prison in Rome, and the Philippians have panicked that Paul is in prison in Rome because that can't be good. And he writes back to them. The first thing he wants to tell them is, what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel, because it has become known throughout the entire palace guard that I am here for Christ. That is losing well. His view is, so long as the gospel's going forward, I don't mind what happens to me. Or he'll say, I am a prisoner for the gospel, but the word of God is not chained. That's what I mean. This sense that we do everything we can to win people to Christ. We're not trying to win culture. We're not trying to win elections, like as a church. We're not trying to win legislation. We're trying to win human beings to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so long as we're still able to do that, we can get punched around the head, metaphorically and maybe even literally, and smile sweetly back. Mm-hmm. That is the role of the church. And I just call that losing well. And it is a dominant theme of the New Testament. It is a dominant theme of the early church. There are many, many texts of those first 2 or 3 centuries where Christians advocate losing well, by which they mean you do your best to persuade people, but when they lock you up in prison, you sing hymns, you pray for them, you bless them, you go to your martyrdom asking God to forgive your killers. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean by losing well. And it commends the gospel.
Yeah. Now, but they didn't have any choice because, of course, they didn't live in a democracy. They didn't have rights. So they couldn't protest. They couldn't elect a new emperor, so to speak. So, but we've got all of that. Aren't we supposed to fight to preserve what we've got?
Well, we use prayer, persuasion, service, and suffering. Yes. All I'm saying is they're the tools. And if we lose, let's not be bad losers.
Yeah.
I am not saying let's go out of our way to lose.
Yeah. And I'm playing the devil's advocate here.
Sure. The devil,
well, not
indeed.
the devil's advocate. I'm playing somebody's advocate. But because that is the argument. And it's very specifically an argument that you're going to get here in the United States versus somewhere.
I'm slowly picking that up. And I will just smile sweetly back and say, well, prayer, persuasion, service, suffering. They're our tools, so let's use them with full energy. Yeah. All I'm saying is when it doesn't go our way, let's not be jerks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I love that. I love those 4 points. Bobby, jump in here. I know you've got some thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the service feature, you can see that in people that aren't believers, but you will definitely see more, as John's saying, with believers. But philanthropy, a lot of the progressive Christians, they might gut the Bible of its doctrine and hold on to service. But I feel like the Christian, they got to serve in the midst of suffering. And I think that this causes that persuasion piece to be challenging. And I'm thinking about Charles Taylor in his book, A Secular Age, and how in the world we live in, we're all greeted with a lot of doubt, which can interrupt our faith. And I wonder, John, for someone like you who grew up in a culture that was more advanced in a secular way, if you have already been able sort of to come to a negotiation of what it looks like to follow Jesus wholeheartedly in a culture that is seemingly secular, as Americans, we are going through such rapid shifting so quickly that I think a lot of people were just showing up to church and thinking that they were persuaded, but it was the suffering and the challenge of our culture that's showing a lot of people, well, maybe I'm not so persuaded after all. Or maybe I have a little bit of this doubt that I got to work through, like Taylor talks about. So I guess, as a person who has written a book on doubt, as you have, how do you stay strong in persuasion while you swim in waters of doubt that before the Reformation, they didn't have to swim in as much? And I think that this is a choice. When we think about Reformation in a melting pot culture with social media, we are greeted by all kinds of opportunities to doubt, yet we're still supposed to be persuaded. And I think, my goodness, if John the Baptist could doubt as the cousin of Jesus, or if Adam and Eve could doubt in paradise, how much more are we susceptible to doubting in Paradise Lost today with over 40,000 denominations? I mean, we just are information overloaded, right?
Yeah. I'm depressed just listening to your question. Can we end the interview now?
Wait, no, John, you're supposed to tell us the answers.
Help us, John.
Which way,
Come
Sydney? Look, the book on persuasion was written by Aristotle 300 years before the Lord. And he said there are 3 factors to persuasion, and one of them is the most important. And you might think, why are you citing Aristotle? But I think he had a brilliant insight. He said part of persuasion is logos, intellectual argument, because we are rational beings. We like to think our views are rational. He said part of it is pathos. This is the, you might say, aesthetic or emotional dimension to persuasion. That sense of aesthetic and beauty are really important features of persuasion. But he said the most important part of persuasion is ethos, which is basically the credibility or character of the persuader. And it seems to me the key to persuasion in our cultural setting right now is to continue the logos and the pathos, that is the logic and the beauty, but the church to actually be a persuasive entity by force of its own compassion and integrity. Mm. So Aristotle's way of putting it was, we are more persuaded by those we trust than by those we don't. Mm. And as soon as you hear that, you think that's the most obvious thing in the world. But now think of it in terms of the church. We are more persuaded by people we trust than by those we don't. Does the wider community trust us? Mm. Mm. I think that is a key point of persuasion. And coming out of this, I mean, I'd add a fourth, because Aristotle, we can forgive him, he didn't know about dunamis, right? Logos, pathos, ethos, and dunamis, the power of the Spirit.
Yeah.
So we have that. But the Spirit animates those other three, including our ethos, the character of the church, the character of the persuader. Now, in Australia, one of the ways we tried to do this, some friends and I, is start the Centre for Public Christianity. And although I don't work for them anymore, I worked for them for 10 years. And we were all about trying to offer Australia logos, pathos, and ethos around the Christian faith. And one of our little mottos, secretly, although we never said this when we were in the public media, was to leave people the impression that those Christians aren't as dumb and mean as we thought.
They're not bullies.
They're not bullies. Mm-hmm. And you might think that's a low bar, but actually I think in this moment we find ourselves, to leave the impression to the secularist in America that church, that evangelical church, isn't as dumb and mean as I thought, leaves them in a position to be open to hear our logos and pathos. Mm.
Yeah. Tim Keller did that well.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he sure did.
I mean, irreplaceably.
Yeah.
But please, Lord, not irreplaceably. Please, more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But what a great picture of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
With Tim.
Yeah.
And not everybody's on that level. Not everybody is brilliant like Keller. Mm. But whoever we are and wherever we are, we do have the power to influence people around us. We might not have the brain power, but we certainly can have those other elements, and especially the ethos.
Yeah. I'm struck by those two passages in the New Testament where Peter and Paul urge their congregations to be open about the faith to unbelievers. One of them is 1 Peter 3:15, of course, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. And then he says, but do this with gentleness and respect.
Yeah.
Straight to ethos.
Yeah.
And Paul in Colossians 4 says, walk in wisdom before the outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your conversation be always full of grace so that you may know how to answer everyone. Mm. And I find this so intriguing. They're not emphasizing what to answer everyone, but how. Mm. See, every Christian listening knows how to answer the skeptic, not necessarily what to answer. You don't have a brain like Tim Keller, but you know how, with grace, gentleness, and respect. Mm.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yep.
Well, I didn't write it. Peter and Paul wrote it, but thanks.
But you quoted it beautifully.
You've been listening to a special edition of Pastor's Perspective. It's not done yet. I just want to set it up again to let you know in case you just tuned in and you're wondering, who is this fascinating guest on the program today? Well, it's Dr. John Dixon, an author, an historian, and a speaker. In fact, he's going to be speaking tonight at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. We would love to see you. It starts at 6:30. cccm.com is where you can get more information, and you can go to John's website. It's johndixon.org, Dickson, johndixon.org. You can listen to his podcast at undeceptions.com. You can purchase his books there as well, including the one that we've been mostly talking about today called Bullies and Saints. You can read about the whole prayer and persuasion and serving and, yes, suffering in that book, Bullies and Saints. Fascinating book. If you've never really read about Christian history, the history of the church before, this could be a good place for you to start because there's a lot of information. I mean, I read it last year and I thought, this is a lot of stuff that I had never known had actually happened. But yeah, it did. And that could be why we have a black eye sometimes in the church.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great book. I highly recommend it. I like church history just in a general sense, but John, I think you just put it in a very accessible way. I mean, for some people, church history is like, what in the world is that? They don't even know anything about it. So
we just think it's what we read in the book of Acts, but there's so much more that has happened in the last 2 days.
Because there was Acts, and then there was Calvary Chapel.
Right.
And then
Acts and the Jesus Revolution.
Yes, right. And we didn't even have Martin Luther in there anywhere. We just jumped right straight from Acts. So, John, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit, and just talk about a few things. Just thinking back over some of the Undeceptions podcast. First of all, in the beginning, I was always like, Undeceptions. Where did he even come up with this, this title? And then I discovered that it was through C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that.
Undeceptions is the title of a now out of print collection of C.S. Lewis essays.
Yes.
And he loved the word Undeceptions. It's a good 16th century word. It's in the Oxford English Dictionary. And it basically means to reveal the truth. An undeception is something that reveals the truth.
Yeah.
In fact, there's this beautiful essay he wrote that's not one of his Christian essays. It was one of his English lit essays about Jane Austen. And the whole essay is about Jane Austen as an undeceiver. That was her project, to undeceive Britain about all sorts of things, including the Christian faith, to sort of expose things. That's the project of Undeceptions. And so I've always loved the word, and I pinched it for my podcast.
That's brilliant. That's great. I'm just thinking back at, there's so many episodes that have been so fascinating. But when you did recently, and maybe we could even just touch on these, you did the Venerable Bede. And I was thinking you were going to do more than one episode.
It deserves it.
It does. I was waiting for the second one to come. So
my team always say, not a double episode, no.
And then there's Alcuin.
Alcuin of York.
Alcuin of York,
yes.
Yeah. Tell us about those two guys really quick.
I want him to have a double episode.
Yes, they're both fantastic.
Okay, so Venerable Bede is really the father of English history.
Yeah.
So, we're way back at around 700, okay?
That's his name. That's his name?
Venerable
That's his title.
Bede.
Okay.
Venerable is his title.
Title, okay.
Bede is his name.
Got it.
And he was the smartest Englishman alive, and was learned in everything from astronomy to arithmetic to obviously Latin, but also history. And he wrote the first history of the English people and used all the sources that were available to him in the period to produce a marvelous work basically about the Christianization of England. How did England become Christian? We know the answer to that question largely through the remarkable work of Bede. Alcuin of York. Oh man, I have a T-shirt with Alcuin on it. I'm not wearing it today, but it is one of my favorite T-shirts.
I was just in York, and when I was in York, I was thinking about you.
Thank you.
Because of that episode, plus I saw the Constantine statue, and I knew that would be something that you...
Well, Alcuin was plucked out of York to become the education secretary for Charlemagne, the ruler of Europe, in about 780. And he transformed Europe just in the 20 years, giving Europe schools for boys and girls, rich and poor, that were free, that trained them in the liberal arts, and that was the beginning of what became the universities of Europe. And it all comes down to this one brainy Christian, Alcuin of York. So he's the greatest European you've never heard of, is how I often describe him.
Okay, tell us, we got just another minute. Tell us about the Dark Ages.
Yes, I can tell you very...
in 1 minute.
I can tell you in 10 seconds about the Dark Ages. They never existed. In the so-called darkest period, we have remarkable living lights in that period who were learned, who were artistic, who were philosophical, and godly.
Yeah.
That might be news to a lot of people because they're like, we always hear about the Dark Ages. They never existed. Check it out in this book here called Bullies and Saints.
So we're right down to the wire here on our broadcast. So once again tonight.
Yep, at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, cccm.com is where to get more information. It begins at 6:30. Dr. John Dixon, our guest today on Pastor's Perspective, and our guest this evening for the summer lecture series that happens on Wednesday nights. Now, Dr. Dixon, you mentioned your T-shirt that you're wearing. You've got a light bulb on your T-shirt. Did you know that Dr. Bobby Conway's logo, if you see it up here on the screen, the top left, it's Bobby's head and a light bulb.
Fantastic.
Yes. So I thought it was Bobby's logo at first when I saw it. But anyway, come on out to Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa tonight at 6:30. We would love to see you, and you can submit your questions for the Q&A right now at cccm.com. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you. Pastor's Perspective was sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa.